Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour on power procurement for eligible retail customers of Illinois Electric Utilities. My name is Megha Hamal. I am the Communications Manager for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be responsible for hosting this presentation today. Next slide, please. Hannah, would you mind advancing the slides? Thank you. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We have also enabled live transcript button at the end, at the Zoom window at the bottom. If you wish to hide the live transcript button, you may simply click on the live transcript button, then hide subtitle. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end to go over the questions. To submit questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of Zoom window. Today's session is being recorded, and a recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under About IPA and Events. Couple of points I want to emphasize before we begin the presentation. The webinar is for general education purpose only. Therefore, we will not be discussing comments that we received through stakeholder feedback session a few weeks ago. Also, continuing legal education is pending on this webinar. After the CLE approval, we will be sending out a survey to all participants, especially attorneys that are utilizing this webinar for CLE credits. We will be asking you to provide your attorney registration number. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our speakers for this session are Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel for the Illinois Power Agency. And our external speakers for today are Mario Bohorquez, Consultant at Leviton and Associates. Mario is also the former Bureau Chief for Office of Planning and Procurement at the IPA. Mario is a leader in energy field with particular expertise in the electric power sector. Mario's areas of technical expertise include power delivery, planning, power generation development, power marketing and trading, portfolio management, and commodity price risk management. Welcome, Mario. Our next external speaker is Katie Orlandi. Katie is the Associate Director at NERA Economic Consulting. She's an expert in the design and implementation of competitive bidding processes for products, including wholesale power and capacity. She also uses her expertise to meet wide-ranging renewable energy procurement goals and policy objectives for her clients. Welcome, Katie. Again, a quick reminder, we will be taking questions from participants towards the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those questions at any time during the presentation. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to give you a quick overview on the IPA Power Hour webinars. As I mentioned before, Power Hour is a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging clean energy issues. During this webinar, the speakers will provide an overview and background on the IPA power procurement for residential and small commercial customers of Illinois Electric Utilities. They will also be discussing the development of the annual electricity procurement plan, including statutory deadlines and plan approval litigation process. And finally, the speakers will provide an overview of the competitive procurement process, its goal and role of the procurement administrator in accordance with the IPA Act. Now, I would like to move to the next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of the Power Hour webinars that are coming in August, September, and October. So please go ahead and register for those webinars today. The registration links are right there in the slide, and you can also go to About IPA events on the IPA website for registration. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview about who we are as an agency. We are an independent state agency created in 2007. Our duties include development and implementation of procurement plan for electricity supply for utility customers. We're also in charge of developing and implementing renewable energy programs. And we are also responsible for implementing the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a public policy designed to implement renewables here in Illinois. Next slide. Without further ado now, I would like to welcome Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel here at the IPA, who will be talking about the IPA power procurement, who, what, and why.
Great, thank you so much, Megha. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right, as Megha mentioned, my name is Brian Granahan. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel at the Illinois Power Agency. And this is really broken up into 4 segments as we go through. And the first segment of this presentation is intended to be an overview, a very basic overview of what it is that we're talking about here. What does the IPA do? What is our role? Then Mario will get into the development of our procurement plans and the content of those plans. I'll come back in and talk about the litigation of those plans, the process for publishing for public comment, litigate them for the ICC, and then Katie will get into the procurement events themselves and the mechanics of those procurement events. So as we go to the next slide, some of this has overlap with what Megha had mentioned, and it is basically just what is the IPA? What do we exist to do? A lot of people know us through our work on RPS implementation or on support for the state's at-risk nuclear plants, or many other things that we're participating in that are more policy-based, but the agency was initially set up in 2007 for the very reason that we're talking about in today's Power Hour presentation. It was set up to establish prepare procurement plans and conduct procurement events to meet the supply requirements of what are known as eligible retail customers of Illinois electric utilities. And that phrase, eligible retail customers, is found in section 16.1.5 of the Public Utilities Act. It comes up quite often, both in our plan and in today's presentation, and we'll have additional slides to talk about who exactly are the eligible retail customers. But the easiest way to think about it is they're default supply customers of utilities. So if you're a customer of ComEd or Ameren and you take supply from your utility, then you are an eligible retail customer, and the IPA is the entity responsible for conducting procurement events, preparing procurement plans, and conducting those procurement events to meet your supply requirements. Now, the IPA does not take title to that supply, to that block energy or that capacity, as we ultimately are not the entity that is actually serving that load. That is the utility itself. So in this sense, the IPA operates almost a bit like a brokerage, where we're acting as a middle person between the market, between sellers on the market who have supply to sell, and the buyers who have load to meet in the form of Illinois electric utilities. One very important aspect of this process is the Illinois Commerce Commission's role. They both approve all of the IPA's procurement plans, and they approve the results of our procurement events. We'll get into the specific players involved in that process in a future slide, but it's not just the IPA doing it. There's actually a pretty robust system of checks and balances in place as between the IPA and the ICC. And then in that last bullet point, the IPA is tasked with also doing a whole host of other things. Those generally operate independent from the development of our annual electricity procurement plan for reasons or with considerations in mind that we'll get to in future slides. So as we go to the next slide, this term eligible retail customers. So who are the eligible retail customers? Well, they're only customers taking distribution service from a participating utility. So we are not procuring supply to meet the supply requirements of, say, municipal electric utilities and their customers, or rural electric cooperatives and their customers. Instead, it's only ComEd customers, Ameren Illinois customers, and Mid-American customers, and even just a portion of Mid-American customers. And that only came about in the last, say, 7 or 8 years or so, that we are also developing our procurement plan to meet the supply requirements of certain levels of Mid-American customers. They must also take supply service from the participating utility. So customers of retail electric suppliers are not included as part of the load that we're required to meet, or the supply we're required to procure to meet load in our procurement plans. those customers ultimately get their supply, and that's met through the retail electric supplier. So it's only those classes that are not declared competitive, which means it's exclusively residential and small commercial customers, and then only those residential and small commercial customers taking supply from the utility and not taking supply from an alternative supplier. It is also not hourly pricing customers. So for instance, myself and our director, Anthony Starr, we're both real-time pricing customers for ComEd. Technically, the IPA is then not procuring our supply, but they are for those customers who take fixed price supply service. So how much of the market exactly is this? If you look at all of the retail sales from these distribution utilities, how much of that is served through the IPA's procurements? It varies. It varies by time. It can be, say, a half of a half, with half of those customers being eligible in the first place for taking default supply, and then maybe half of them actually doing so, or in some cases, more like a third of a half, where when you have a lot of customers who switch to alternative suppliers through, say, municipal aggregation, then the portion of supply that the IPA is meeting through its procurements is quite a bit lower. On the other hand, if you have those municipal aggregation contracts expiring and those customers are going back to default supply service, then we're procuring for more than we would otherwise. So it really varies, and we break this down in our annual procurement plan each year and rely on load forecasts provided by the utilities to determine exactly how much it is that we need to procure in order to meet these supply requirements. Then as we go to the next slide. So we are procuring on behalf of eligible retail customers to meet their supply requirements. Well, what is it exactly that we are procuring? The law uses the term standard wholesale products, and it gives a whole laundry list of things that can be considered standard wholesale products. By and large, our procurement plans have been focused on block energy products, specifically monthly on-peak and off-peak block energy products, and capacity hedging for Ameren, Illinois, and not the variety of other products that are described in the statute. We look to a 5-year window in terms of how far out we procure. What that means is that we're looking in the next 5 years and trying to make assessment of what load is required to be served over that period through our procurements, and then designing a hedging strategy around procuring a certain amount for different parts of that period across the next 5 years. We've been operating with a 3-year window for the most part. The further out you go, the higher the risk premiums are, for instance, and the less certainty you have. So by and large, we look about 3 years out. 5 years is the maximum by statute, but we're pretty much just procuring for 3 years, as the value of procuring, say, in years 4 and year 5 is maybe a little bit less. There's also been additional guidance issued by the ICC as to what standard wholesale products are. Specifically, if you were to go back to 2014 and our 2015 electricity procurement plan, there was arguments around whether some demand side products or energy efficiency products could potentially be considered standard wholesale products. And what I've got here in this slide are a few things, some of the guidance that the commission gave at that time. So that definition cannot be considered static, and it depends on the products themselves and whether they may be traded in the wholesale markets at a given time. And an examination of the attributes of those products and whether they're consistent with other commonly traded products in the wholesale market, must be routinely traded in the liquid market. So ideally, these are products that are being traded outside of the IPA to be considered standard wholesale products under the guidance from the commission some 8 years ago. But by and large, for the plans that we put together, we are looking at monthly on-peak and off-peak block energy and then capacity procured for Ameren, Illinois. As we go to the next slide. So who are the players in this entire process? Well, the IPA is, of course, the entity tasked with putting this procurement plan together, litigating it before the ICC, and really overseeing all aspects of the plan's development and implementation. The ICC also has a really central role associated with approving that procurement plan. So those plans are litigated before the Illinois Commerce Commission, approving the procurement results. So when we conduct a procurement event and we go out to the market and try to bring energy under contract, that ultimately goes to the ICC for approval, and the IPA does not do any of this unilaterally. Also approving the contract forms used for those transactions and the benchmarks that are effectively a price over which we will not accept a certain bid for a certain period, kind of like a maximum price that we think is in the best interest of customers to pay. And the ICC also has a role of publishing procurement results. And there's other roles described under section 61.5 as well. We have a consultant called our procurement planning consultant who helps us develop these procurement plans and a lot of the analyses supporting them. And then Katie, who will be giving the last presentation today, is from our procurement administrator, NERA Economic Consulting. and they are hired to conduct the procurement events themselves, the actual competitive procurement processes, including the development of a lot of the procurement requirements, standard contract forms, interfacing with the potential bidders, and a lot of that is set out in the Public Utilities Act if you wanted to take a look at it. There's a whole laundry list of responsibilities that apply to the procurement administrator. The ICC also has a consultant in this process called the procurement monitor. The procurement monitor oversees the procurement event and then provides a confidential report, which even the IPA does not see, to the commission regarding the results of the procurement event. The procurement administrator also prepares a report on its own that describes the results, and that also gets sent to the commission, but the IPA does have access to that. Then the Illinois Electric Utilities are the buyers under these contracts. They also do all of the day ahead and real-time balancing through procurements done in that area. So we're basically building up these big blocks and they sort of fit a curve, but there's a lot of balancing that has to be done day ahead in real time. They handle all of that, and then obviously they file the tariff sheets reflecting changes in charges and do balancing between the costs of what's put under a contract and the cost of what's actually paid through the purchase of electricity adjustment found on customers' bills. And then there's the standard wholesale product bidders and suppliers. So those are the sellers under our procurement events. They may be power plants. They may be people who have contracts with power plants. They may be trading desks who came into rights of this power, but they are the sellers who have rights to block energy or capacity and are selling them in our procurement event. And that's a basic overview of who the players are. And then as we go to the next slide, lastly, what are the objectives? What are we trying to accomplish qualitatively? How do we know whether we've done a good job? So we kind of talked about what we're procuring, who we're procuring on behalf of, who's all involved in this process. Now, what are we trying to achieve? Well, we have a lot of very firm guidance from the Public Utilities Act about that. And it's trying to achieve the lowest total cost over time, taking into account any benefits of price stability. And if you go through some prior commission orders, you'll see different arguments around what does this exactly mean. I think the way that we've looked at it is we want to achieve the lowest cost, but we also don't want to achieve the lowest cost without taking into account what it means to have more stable prices. For example, if we procured everything in day-ahead and real-time markets, we probably would achieve the lowest cost possible simply because there's no risk premiums associated with procuring a lot of things in advance. Wouldn't be the lowest cost all the time, but perhaps on balance over a long enough period of time, that's where you'd have the lowest premiums. On the other hand, that would cause a lot of instability in rates and leave customers exposed to potential price fluctuations in times when prices are particularly high. So what we've tried to do is prepare a hedging strategy, as Mario will get into, which properly balances these different considerations, where we're trying to achieve low costs for eligible retail customers, but also taking into account the fact that we want those prices to be fairly stable, and we want to have a nice blend in our portfolio where we're not trying to time the market, but we're trying to buy at different points in time to produce a good composite outcome. In terms of the bid process itself, there's no post-bid negotiation involved. Bidding is done through sealed binding commitment bidding with pay-as-bid settlement. So a party bids in a certain price, that's what they're going to be paid for their supply. And it's not a clearing price like is used through, say, a regional transmission organization capacity auctions. It is what they bid in at that they're ultimately settling at for block energy products. And then the provision for the selection of bids and the basis of price. So we rank order the different bids received for, say, May of 2024 on peak power, and the lowest price bids that qualify ultimately are the ones that are selected. And that's the process that we use for a competitive procurement process. It's a fairly short release that we give after the fact as to what the prices are, what quantities are met, but a lot of the information about the bidding process is kept confidential to ensure the competitiveness of the process going forward. So that's just a basic overview of what happens. All of this is ultimately proposed through our procurement plans themselves. Those are developed by the IPA with the assistance of its procurement planning consultant, and then filed with the ICC for approval. I'll turn it over to Mario now, who's going to give you an overview of the electricity procurement planning process, how we put those plans together, what they contain, and what considerations inform the development of those plans.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for giving us such a great introduction to the procurement planning and execution of those plans. And a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today and who will be seeing this video in the future. Today, I will focus mostly on process. So it may be a little bit dry for some people who are expecting a lot of technical discussion, but it is process. And at some other point in the future, we can have a technical discussion about risk management. But today we'll talk about process and how risk management plays a role into that. This is my perspective, and as I had, Megan mentioned earlier, I joined the IPA first in 2012 as the first Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief. And that was quite a humbling and learning experience, obviously. So I'm going to turn off this camera for now, so we'll focus on the slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. The plan is essentially a set of risk management strategies combined with a tactical implementation. And that is, those things are really there to mitigate electricity supply risk. And that's our procurement plan. Brian mentioned a policy objective earlier, he read it, but there are a few words in this policy objective that I would like to highlight, because quite a bit of our discussion today and the focus of the procurement plan and execution of that plan deal with the words that we have here: affordable, electric service. Obviously, we are talking about electricity, not other commodity or not natural gas, electric service. Lowest total cost over time. This is really important, as well as the last two words, price stability. So to me, this is a guiding light. We're focusing on affordability, cost over time, and price stability. So as you will see later today, there are a few components of this plan that deal with that. For affordable prices and lowest price, we take advantage of competitive markets. For that, we use blocks of energy. We procure blocks of energy that are tradable in the market. They're fairly liquid, so we avoid the large bid-ask spreads. And then we layer this procurement of power over a period of several years, and we do several procurements for each particular delivery year. So at the end, our customers, as you know who the customers are, they receive fairly stable prices over time and a fairly decent price. So we will see that more in this slide presentation today. Okay, there are, as Brian mentioned, professionals in the field. The IPA has some excellent resources, as well as our planning consultant, who has a great deal of experience and depth of experience in dealing with these processes. But the next few slides will talk about process in more detail. Next slide, please. Well, the electricity plan itself, it is about 100 pages long, and it has a few chapters that are interesting to read, especially if you're interested in the details. For instance, the legislative regulatory requirements. There's quite a bit of details on the things that Brian mentioned. But from a more technical perspective, I would encourage you to take a look at chapter 3, where we deal with load forecast. The load forecast is perhaps the main factor for consideration, not the only one, but a very important factor for consideration, because it tells us how much of this supply we need to hedge and for what periods of time. So we'll take a good look at the load forecast in the preparation of the plan. We also look at how much there is already in the portfolio, the utilities supply portfolio. So we need to identify the gap. So this is also very important when it comes to issuing a set of targets for procurement that the agency does send to the procurement administrator a set of targets for each procurement event. Then chapter 6 to me is the most technical of all. If you're interested in understanding some of the modeling that is done, some of the mathematics that is done to identify or quantify that risk, I would suggest take a look at chapter 6 of the plan. And if you want to get really deep into this, maybe someday you are unable to sleep and you want to do something to make you sleepy, to take a look at the 2014 plan for a detailed discussion of this risk analysis. On chapter 7, here is where we outline the tactical implementation of those strategies that we had already reviewed in prior chapters. Then the last chapter, here's where we talk about process design. This is particularly important for the actual procurement events that Katie will be discussing later on. Next slide, please. Well, the procurement, the process of developing the plan is an ongoing process. It never really stops, mostly because the people, the practitioners who are involved in this effort are constantly year-round participating in the market, observing the market, and understanding the markets. For instance, we take a close look at the results of prior procurement events. We try to understand liquidity in those events, the participation, who is participating, and what are the range of prices we're looking, and what sort of volumes are we able to secure. And then we try to understand trends, if there are any in this market. So we also try to understand very clearly what the regional transmission organizations are doing, changes in those processes that they control. We try to understand what is happening at the FERC and at the Department of Energy as well. So we are educated practitioners. We look at energy markets, like I said, we look at fuels, particularly natural gas is something we look at because it's a key driver to electricity prices in the Midwest. And then we have a good understanding, we try to get a good understanding of load patterns, load switching from the utility to competitive supplies and back and forth, and maybe economic activity as well. What happened with COVID it is something that we're cognizant on. Right now, we know more about that than before, but it was quite interesting going through the first periods of the pandemic. But more formally, in the spring is when we actually begin to actually sit down and start to write things. So we take a look at what's the market doing, what new reliability risks are showing up. MISO, for instance, the retirement of power plants is a concern. We refresh our strategies and we write the initial draft plan. In the summer, that's when things get really interesting and we kick into high gear when we receive a load forecast from the utilities. Each one of the utilities sends us their load forecast, which, by the way, they are excellent. I have worked with utility companies before, and this is something that I take my hats off to the utility companies here in Illinois. They really know what they're doing when it comes to load forecasting. And I guess they have to do it because this is kind of bread and butter for them. You know, they have to forecast the load so they understand the system and understand how to dispatch the system and the distribution system that they have. We analyze those load-related risks. As I mentioned, load is perhaps a big risk for us that we need to manage. Analyze the supply portfolio, how much they have already procured, and how that needs to be procured. From time to time, we go out and seek stakeholder input. This year is an example of that. We saw quite a bit of volatility and price escalation in the spring period. And it was no surprise. We saw it coming kind of. We were looking at natural gas prices, but we saw quite a bit of price escalation and price volatility during the procurement events that we held in the spring. So we reached out to stakeholders and asked them to see what are you thinking? You know, what are you thinking about this? Is there anything we should be doing differently for our planning purposes? And we received that. We are very appreciative of that. And then after this, that small red arrow that you see there, that's where we are today. In fact, we're getting ready to review the first draft of the plan, and we'll continue to do that through the middle of August when we post that plan, draft plan for comments. That's where we seek comments from the public. We hold public hearings, and then once we receive comments, it's mostly in written form, other than the public hearings. And then we revise the draft plan and submit the plan for approval to the Illinois Commerce Commission. And Brian will get into more details of the approval process later. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, load forecast is a very important one. And in this slide, what I would like to highlight is switching. When we say switching, we talk about load, customers going from the utility supply to the competitive market supply, or vice versa. Customers load going from competitive supply to the utility supply. This can make things very challenging and very interesting, because it is difficult to forecast that, especially for municipal aggregation programs, because some of those can be very large and some of those can move quite a bit of load in and out of the utilities obligation. So that is something that we scratch our heads every year trying to understand, and but the utilities have been doing a fairly good job at monitoring those events, so that give us some guidance in their load forecast. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that we analyzed risk drivers, in particular load forecast risk, and this is kind of a table that shows the risk driver. What's the term of that effect of that risk, and what is the impact? Obviously, if there is a risk out there, but the impact is minimum, so we really don't spend a lot of time on that, because there are other risks that need more attention and more immediate attention. For instance, like I said earlier, switching in and out of utility supply is one. Another one to highlight is, as we observe these markets and observe load and load projections, changes in weather can be a problem. If we move up to the next slide, please. Yeah, I was getting my head a little bit ahead on this. So yeah, weather can be a very challenging thing. A few years ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago, we were mostly concerned with summer load being a big driver of problems, I guess. Not so much in the winter. There was a little bit of a spike in the winter time. But lately, we have seen more of both, more of the effect of weather in the summer and more of the effect of weather in the winter time. So as we look at this load forecast, we need to be cognizant of this changing risk. Another risk, and this is nothing not much we can do about, is fuel price. Fuel can tend to move around quite a bit. For instance, in the Midwest, natural gas is a fuel for many of the power plants that set the marginal price for electricity. And then if you see prices of fuel rising very rapidly, you can expect electricity prices to rise as well. Like I said, there is not much you can do about this, the instance of fuel prices, but you can do something about layering your, about managing portfolio by layering your procurement of power over time in relatively small quantities at a time. So in essence, what we're trying to do with this plan is to hedge over fuel price spikes. And I'll show you an example in a little bit. Next slide, please. In the plan, you will see hedging strategies, and I'm not going to go over every one of those strategies. I'll give you an example just to give you a flavor for that. One is to maintain a balanced portfolio over time. As I mentioned earlier, you don't really want to buy too much of a hedge for a period of time where you can expect load switching, for instance. So this is a lesson that we learned a few years ago in 2012, 2013, and I'll go over that in a little bit. But this is an example of that. Another one, now looking at technical implementation, is we procure physical power delivered to the load zone. Well, in electricity markets, you can buy power delivered to a node or an aggregate of nodes. So this is this comes from the independent system operators, the RTOs that manage the spot markets. So there you can buy power delivered to different points, to different zones. But if you buy power at a point or a zone or a node that is not where you're going to consume that power, or you're going to sell that power, then what happens is that there is a risk that is introduced, and that is called a basis risk. You really don't want to take on basis risk unless your reward is quite high. And in this case, it is really not worth it. So from the time I remember until now, we procure physical power delivered to the load zone when it's settled. So the load zone of ComEd, the load zone of Mid-American, or the load zone of Ameren, Illinois. Another one that we have in the tactical implementation is avoid, or try to avoid, periods of high price volatility. That is because what happens during periods of high price volatility, prices moving up and down, even intraday, sellers tend to get kind of worried about showing a price or offering a price in the procurement event and holding the price for a while until there is clarity on where they are winners. So the issue with that is that because of there is this movement of prices, and there's a little bit of risk that the sellers are taking on when showing a price, then we can expect some price premiums. So we don't really like to pay for high premiums. So, but we understand that it's the reality of how these markets work. So we try to avoid these periods of high volatility. But next, I'm going to show you an interesting slide. And next slide, please. This is just a representative, the numbers here are just to give you an idea of what has been happening lately with electricity prices and how the rise of prices essentially coincided with the time when we were doing some hedging earlier this year. So as you can tell, back in January, prices looked fairly stable, January, February. Prices of natural gas, this is dollars per MMBTU, but ranging about $4, maybe $4.50 per MMBTU. And electricity prices were around $40 to $45, maybe a little bit less than that. But all of a sudden, around March and April, prices began to rise very quickly. We exactly on April 11, when we were, April 18, we did our first procurement for this springtime. We were kind of shocked to see these high prices. And so we bought some hedges at that time, and then we held a second procurement a month later where we bought some additional hedges. But the point here is really the most interesting thing here is that the procurement planning and the execution of that plan have provisions to allow for the holding a procurement event on one date and making a determination of whether we should hold a second procurement event to cover any open positions that we have left. So the plan worked, the process worked, and this is something we all should be proud of. As a consequence of this issue that we saw in the spring, as I mentioned earlier, we issue a request to stakeholders seeking their comments on our procurement plan, whether it's reasonable what we had, whether we should employ a different process or things, or different products or things like that. So much thanks to everyone for that, for contributing. Next slide, please. I will take just very, very little time on this slide. As I mentioned earlier, we seek from input from stakeholders and the public, and then we compose our plan, finalize the plan, and then we submit that for approval. Yeah, I think the last slide, please. Next slide, please. this is, I think we can tell a long story here. So I'm going to try to be brief. But take a look at what happened on the left chart, far left. Back in 2012, that's we did a very nice size procurement, but then in 2013, and we didn't procure any power. And coincidentally, that was the year 2012 is when I joined the agency, and our procurement plan for 2013 had no procurement at all. So I was a little bit disappointed. But the reality is that there had been so much load shifting away from the utility that there was no really need to buy any more power for load that was not there. In fact, the utilities were left a bit long, and then they had to dispose of this power in the spot market. So in 2014, we bought a little bit more. We felt a little more comfortable about that. That's the year when we did quite a bit of analysis on risk analysis. So again, I encourage you to take a look at the 2014 procurement plan. It is on the IPA's website. Then after that, the amount of power that we have procured year after year has been fairly stable, about 30,000 gigawatt hours in each one of those procurements. Now, the next slide, the one in the center, is another one that's quite interesting. And notice there seems to be a trend, or there seems to have been a trend from 2014 through 2020, where prices were going down and down. We started at $38 per megawatt hour. We ended up $25 per megawatt hour. That looked like a very decent price back in 2020. And then in 2021, we saw a jump from $25 and change to $30 and change. So I guess the story here is that no matter what price is going up or down, these processes that we have already articulated in the plans work. And in fact, even though we have seen price escalation in the real time, when we go to procurement, over time, the customers will be paying a weighted average price of the many procurements we have done for the same delivery period. So that is all good news, I think. And then the slide to the right is just a little bit of bragging. The IPA has been responsible for several $1 billion of procurements every year. And the latest 2021 that we have data for, we almost reached $1 billion in procurement for that year. Well, and this reaches the end of my presentation, and I hope you take away from this is that the procurement process and the development of the procurement plan is a process that has been working for many years, and is something that we don't take lightly. We employed really experts in the field. We do the math behind this, and there's a lot of thinking and a lot of input that comes into putting together these plans. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. I am finished.
Great, thank you, Mario. So back to the process for getting that plan approved. So as Mario talked about, all of that is wrapped up in the plan, all the risk analysis, all the modeling, the use of the load forecast to determine procurement quantities, the hedging strategy that we employ, how we form that hedging strategy based on the different external considerations we talked about. And then if we go to the next slide, this outlines how we then publish that plan and move that plan through the process to commission approval. So we receive load forecast from utilities by July 15th, but there is a process in some cases that precedes it. Sometimes we're just working on the plan through June and July. This year, as I believe Mario mentioned, we had written stakeholder questions, and we had a webinar, and there were other ways in which we tried to get feedback from the market, given some of the price volatility that we'd seen, given the changes in MISO capacity prices. So we went through a preceding process even before we received load forecasts of getting feedback. But our draft plan is out by August 15th by law. It's subject to a 30-day comment process, and we have public hearings in each of the affected utility service territories as well. Receive those comments, file that plan with the Illinois Commerce Commission in 2 weeks. It's then litigated with the commission across a 90-day period, and then we receive a final order from the commission, usually in late December, although sometimes it's earlier if there aren't contested issues after that 90-day proceeding. And that's how that plan then makes its way through a regulatory approval process. The commission issues its final order, and then we have authorization to conduct procurement events from there. So we go to the next slide. A few changes over time regarding the content of those plans from a statutory standpoint. If you were to go back to the beginning of the last decade, we were including things like sourcing agreements from clean coal plants as part of that plan through separate statutory provisions that said, put this in there as well. So that became a huge issue, something that was litigated up through Illinois appellate courts. There was the introduction of energy efficiency, and I forgot exactly what public act it was through, but it's about the 2012 to 2013 timeframe where we had a separate provision in the Public Utilities Act that said include energy efficiency programs as part of your supply portfolio. And then that was pulled out through Public Act 990906 and through a separate expansion of the utilities energy efficiency portfolio standard. So our procurement plans used to have energy efficiency programs as part of them and a whole appendix of the different programs that we included. That ended about 6 years ago. We now have a separate planning process for the procurement of renewable energy resources, primarily renewable energy credits. Many are familiar with that process. That occurs every 2 years. We just got through with the litigation of our most recent long-term renewable resource procurement plan. But if you were to go back to the beginning of the last decade, renewables were a big part of those plans. And then through Public Act 1020662, there are some new provisions about supply from high voltage direct current transmission lines. Don't want to get into those too much here because that will ultimately be part of the plan that we publish and we'll receive comments on in a few weeks' time. We go to the next slide. Some other ways in which our plans have changed over time that don't extend directly from changes in statute. Mario mentioned municipal aggregation. When we have a lot of load shifting, it creates a lot of underlying analysis in the plans themselves for how our hedging strategies should handle that sort of load shifting. And then obviously capacity price changes. We've had 2 periods within MISO Zone 4 where capacity prices have shot up, and that raises questions then about should we hedge more, should we be hedging at all in periods where those prices are low or stable. And so that ends up being something that creates a lot more content as part of our plans. General energy market volatility, as evidenced by our most recent stakeholder process. Now there are questions about, given the presence of carbon mitigation credit contracts, which could serve as a credit back to ratepayers of ComEd in times when prices are high, should we leave some of those positions open or should we still be hedging at the same levels? And then broader resource adequacy concerns, again, evidenced by our most recent comment process. Is there something we could be doing that would actually help address broader resource adequacy concerns through the tool of our energy procurement plan? So those are the sorts of things externally that could then inform the content of the plan that we end up publishing and ultimately filing with the ICC. As we go to the next slide. Couple things to just highlight how this has changed over time. These are just a few exemplary procurement plan approval proceedings, then I'll hand it over to Katie. If you were to go back to 2015, which is right around when I joined the agency, this was a plan litigated in 2014, our 2015 procurement plans. You see that disconnect where the 2015 plan is actually what we developed in 2014 as it's for 2015. That was a proceeding that had 9 contested issues and a 319-page administrative order from the ICC, a whole host of issues that were litigated over as part of that plan. Then you go forward a few years, now you're dealing with 17 contested issues, primarily around energy efficiency programs in a 106-page order. And then most recently, our 2022 plans. This is the plan that we developed in 2021 and ultimately published in the fall of 2021. There were no contested issues in that proceeding. Once renewables were taken out, energy efficiency was taken out, clean coal is no longer as acute a concern. We're now in a place where we're talking about the nuts and bolts of our hedging strategy, whether on energy or whether on capacity. And as a consequence, we don't see the same sorts of lengthy proceedings or the same sorts of levels of participation in the ICC approval proceeding for our annual electricity procurement plan as we had before or as we do for our renewables plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie. She's going to get into the competitive procurement process a bit. From a sequencing standpoint, this is a situation now where we've gotten a plan through the ICC. It proposes certain procurement events, hedging at certain levels, procuring certain products. And now we move into the stage where the ICC has issued its order and we're conducting competitive procurement events.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brian. So as Brian stated, I work for Near Economic Consulting, and we're the procurement administrator for the Illinois Power Agency's competitive procurements for energy and capacity. So as Brian mentioned, I'm going to spend the first half of the presentation walking through the procurement process, and then I'll discuss the goals, the procurement administrator's role and a very brief overview of the 2022 spring and fall energy and capacity procurements. Next slide, please. So the request for proposals, or RFP, competitive procurement process, and the role of the procurement administrator are provided in the IPA Act. So as Brian mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's a long list of responsibilities specified in the Act, and then we're going to complete in each event. The procurement process can really be thought of as moving through several phases that typically for an energy and capacity procurement event will take 3 to 4 months from start to completion. So I'm going to introduce those phases now and then provide you with more details on the next 4 slides. So the first phase, this is the procurement development and promotion phase. It takes the most amount of time. I put 2 to 3 months here because that's pretty typical for energy and capacity. This phase could take longer if there are major changes stemming from the IPA's procurement plan relative to the prior year. But this phase really includes the release of the request for proposals and then all the activities that are completed prior to receiving and evaluating proposals, which are the applications that are submitted to us by participants that are interested in bidding. The next phase is the administration of the proposal process, and this is when the procurement administrator qualifies bidders to bid. This takes about a month. Next, we'll receive and evaluate bids on the bid date. That's 1 day. And then lastly, we'll enter into the final phase, which is the post-bid process, where we report the results to the commission. And if approved, the utilities will move to contract execution. And this phase takes about 7 days. Next slide, please. So once the IPA's procurement plan is approved, we can begin work on procurement development. We're going to prepare detailed RFP rules that contain the qualification requirements, bidding and bid evaluation procedures and protocols. We're also going to develop the standard contract forms in consultation with the IPA and the commission and other interested parties subject to commission oversight. We'll hold a comment process, which is the opportunity for suppliers and other stakeholders to submit feedback. Once the comment process concludes, the comments are discussed with the parties and filed with the commission, and then the final versions of the RFP and standard contract forms are issued. At that point, no further modifications are made to the contract, and applicants will be required to accept the terms prior to bidding. And so that really means that all bidders are agreeing to the same contract, and it enables bids to be evaluated on a price-only basis. So promotion of the procurement event will be ongoing through this time in order to encourage participation in the comment process, and then generally to raise awareness of this opportunity. So promotional activities will include holding a webcast. We'll place ads in energy trading publications. We manage a large email registrant list and can send announcements with upcoming reminders and deadlines. So the procurement website, IPA-EnergyRFP.com, it's updated with all the documentation that's necessary for bidders to participate, and it houses other information such as those announcements and frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. So next we'll open the proposal process and we'll begin receiving qualification materials from suppliers. The proposal process is structured as 2 steps, and this is described in the Act. So first, suppliers are going to submit the Part 1 proposal to become qualified bidders, and the qualification requirements are really geared towards ensuring that an entity can perform under the supplier contract and will comply with the rules. Also importantly, in the Part 1, all bidders must agree to the terms of the standard contract form. Only qualified bidders can move forward to the second step. That's the submission of the Part 2 proposal. Under Part 2, there are additional certifications required, such as certifying that bids placed are binding. Applicants will also post bid assurance collateral, which is returned if a bidder has no winning bids or shortly after a winning bidder signs the contract. Next slide. Once bidders are qualified, we're going to move to that next phase. It's the bid date. Bidders that complete the Part 1 and Part 2 proposals can submit bids to us during a short 1 to 2 hour time frame on a set bid date. The bids are then evaluated on a price-only basis, again, by the procurement administrator. About a week or so ahead of the bid date, we would hold a training session just to make sure that all bidders are familiar with the bidding procedures and protocols. Importantly, this has been mentioned a couple of times, as required by the Act, the evaluation will consider only bids that meet or beat a market-based price benchmark that's developed using a confidential methodology and approved by the Commission prior to the bid date. So the benchmark is developed by the procurement administrator in consultation with Commission staff, the IPA staff, and the procurement monitor. Next slide. The last phase is the post-bid process. So within 2 days of receipt of bids, the procurement administrator submits a report to the Commission with the results and a recommendation for acceptance or rejection of the bids based on the price benchmark and other factors that have been observed in the procurement process. In the same time frame, the procurement monitor is also going to submit a report to the Commission. Their report will include an assessment of bidder behavior, as well as an assessment of the procurement administrator's compliance with the procurement process and rules. Within 2 days of receipt of the report, the Commission renders a decision on the results, and if approved, the contracts are executed within 3 days of that approval. There's a public information release that happens the day of the Commission decision. It includes the names of successful bidders and the load-weighted average of the winning bid prices for each contract type and contract term. Next slide. So this slide provides the guiding principles of the procurement design. First off, there are many elements of the procurement design in the Act, as Brian mentioned. That includes the auction format. It must be a sealed bid format. Bidders are paid as they bid. The evaluation is price only. And then, like any good design, there's a contingency plan in place. But generally, other guiding principles that are followed by the procurement administrator in the design include to use a fair and transparent process. And this encourages and promotes participation and competition. Use only open and non-discriminatory qualification requirements, and then, of course, to use a transparent bid evaluation procedure. So a successful procurement design for energy and capacity is aiming to ensure that the resulting prices are both market reflective and on the basis of robust competition. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a little more detail on the role of the procurement administrator. As discussed, we designed the procurement process in accordance with the Act. Following Commission approval of the plan, we serve as the interface between the utility and suppliers. We manage the proposal process to ensure that bidder qualifications are evaluated equitably and fairly. We develop the benchmarks. We receive and evaluate bids on a price-only basis and then present the results to the Commission. We provide the results to the utilities so that they can proceed with contract execution with winning suppliers. And then importantly, on an ongoing basis, we maintain confidentiality of supplier and bidding information in a manner that's consistent with all laws, rules, regulations, and tariffs. Next slide, please. So on my final slide here, I provide a very brief overview of the 2022 spring and fall procurements for energy and capacity for ComEd, Ameren, and MidAmerican. So the procurement plan that was approved in 2021 and the utility forecasts are going to determine the targets that are available to be procured this year. The procurement events for each company are held simultaneously, so that streamlines the process for bidders, and also it encourages bidders to bid on targets across all 3 companies. The product in the energy procurements is block energy for a company in a month, or for combinations of months during either on-peak or off-peak hours. And the product for in the capacity event for Ameren is capacity credits called zonal resource credits that are used to satisfy the company's resource adequacy requirements with the regional transmission operator. The evaluation will consider only bids that meet or beat benchmarks. The energy procurement evaluation is going to identify the least cost package of the bids that are received, and aim to fill those targets. For capacity, the evaluation is going to select the lowest price bids to fill the target for the planning year. And a last note, the results, which again are subject to approval by the Commission, will become the retail supply charges for customers. And so those charges are developed by the companies in accordance with the tariffs that are filed and approved by the Commission. Next slide.
Thank you, Katie, for such a great overview. So that concludes our presentation. Maybe we want to spend a few minutes on the Q&A. I also want to be mindful of everyone's time. I am looking at the questions that are submitted. So Olivia Matthews from the IPA has a question for Katie. The question is, what is the purpose of the collateral used during the administration process, given that it is ultimately returned?
Sure, good question. So Olivia, they'll post collateral ahead of the bid date, and that collateral is held because if they win, if their bids are selected as winning bids, then they need to, and if they're approved, then they'll need to sign the contract. It ensures that the bids that they submit are binding. And then as soon as they sign that contract, the money is returned. Or if they don't have a winning bid, the money is returned.
Thank you, Katie. Any other questions at this time?
Megan, this is Brian. One thing I do want to note really quick, because we have this opportunity in case anybody wants to put questions in the chat now, is, as I mentioned, our upcoming plan will be published August 15th, and parties will have 30 days to provide comment on that plan. We offer a cover letter release with that plan that outlines exactly how you offer comments. And then there's also the opportunity to offer comment at public hearings. So to the extent you're looking to provide comment on the upcoming electricity procurement plan, that opportunity will be available in the coming weeks with the process described in that cover letter.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, that's a great point. We did actually get another question. Looks like it is from Olivia for Mario. What is the difference between the energy price and energy cost? This is in reference to the slide with the 3 bar graphs. So let me go back to that particular slide. Mario, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, that is a good question, and I'm glad someone asked it, Olivia. Well, the energy price is the unit price. This is $dollars per megawatt hour that we paid. The energy cost is essentially the number of megawatt hours times the price. So the total cost of that energy. So that is essentially the difference.
Thank you, Mario.
You're welcome.
So, okay, looks like we don't have any other questions coming in. We have provided contact information of speakers that presented at this session today in this presentation. So if you do have additional questions, please definitely, do not hesitate to send them a question. And on behalf of the IPA, I want to thank all attendees for joining this webinar. We hope this session was educational. I also want to thank our speakers for providing such an excellent overview on power procurement. So with that, I want to also encourage everyone to register for the upcoming IPA Power Hour webinars for August, September, and October. Those registration links are provided in the presentation today. So with that, I want to conclude this presentation for today, and we hope to see you on the next Power Hour. Thank you.